If you do have questions, you can submit them online on Talkback at myersparkbaptist.org. And if you have a question that you didn't submit, but you'd like to speak it, just wait till we can bring the microphone over to you, and we have a good amount of questions. So, but we can give space for that as well. And just first, how'd you come to your message? How'd you land upon that scripture in Ephesians?
Well, this week, that scripture from Ephesians was picked many months, probably 8 months before this week. And wow. It was a lectionary text, and we planned out way ahead. And so this has just happened to be the lectionary text that I was going to preach on this week from Ephesians. And over the next few weeks, you can preach maybe the whole book of Ephesians if you stay semi-continuous with it. Each week in and out. So it was already on the lectionary calendar, and it's one of my favorite texts in the Bible, particularly because of its emphasis on peace. And so I just thought I was going to preach a run-of-the-mill peace sermon. And then, of course, there was the assassination attempt last Saturday, and that got my mind thinking, more about what is the message of peace in relationship to that event. And then, of course, there was the reaction to that assassination attempt, which gave me even more to think about and reflect on as I prepared this message. So I would say the text was already there because it's lectionary this time. Sometimes I will change a text based on something that happened in the world, but this case I didn't need to do that. But I think the reaction to this assassination and the language and rhetoric that people began to use and the coalescing around the words political violence and the constant refrain of that from the mouth of every politician it's now been a week, and the constant saying, we condemn, there's no, and this particular phrase, there's no place for that kind of violence in America. And it's almost what's not being said that was more disturbing to me in that rhetoric from both sides of the political aisle that got my mind thinking about the words that Paul was proclaiming to the church in Ephesus, but also remember that Ephesus, I didn't get into this, the book of Ephesus contains about a third of the letter to Colossians in it. So it's already adapting a third of the letter of Colossians and then adding and interpreting the letter of Colossians in it. So many people believe that the book of Ephesians, or the letter to the church in Ephesus, is actually a cover letter that was put on top of a collection of letters of Paul's that were sent around to churches in Asia Minor. And so imagining this as a cover letter sent not just to the church in Ephesus, but to a whole host of churches in what's described as the Lycus River Valley in Asia Minor. That includes Colossia, Laodicea, Smyrna, many of the churches, in fact, that are described in the book of Revelation. So that's who Paul's writing to, and we actually don't know if it was Paul, but we think it was somebody in the line of Paul that was writing and wrote this cover letter. And I tried to think about, well, what would it have been like for the people living in those Roman imperial cities that had been conquered by Rome and established with Roman colosseums and altars to peace and altars to Caesar that said peace all over the place? What would they think when Paul started talking about Jesus being the one who brought peace? And I think they would see it as far more of a treasonous and seditious act than we do. Yeah. We read it and we're like, oh, that's nice. Thanks, Paul. You finally said something nice. Thank you. And instead, at that time, it would have been seen as a declaration of war against the empire and a critique of Caesar's concept of peace. So I thought that was helpful in getting at, I think when politicians were talking about peace after the assassination attempt, they weren't talking about the same kind of peace that we talk about in church.
Yeah, that's really a question that I even wrote down, that a lot of times when people are preaching peace, they really are intending violence. And one thing that I really wonder is if all the looking for the political affiliation of this guy, of this 20-something-year-old, and what was his motive, all of it seems to really just be finding who can we blame, who can we retaliate against. One political party saying, can we condemn all Democrats who are instigated by this one person's action?
100%. That's a very astute observation. I think that part of the goal is to use the violence, which is an act of violence itself.
Yeah.
And not to use the violence to create peace, right? That would be what I was trying to do. What I think Paul's trying to do is to say, no, this is a symptom of a broader societal problem. Not Democrats are to blame, Biden is to blame, Trump is only to blame, et cetera, right? Like, it's very easy to go down this road. Do political leaders incense violence through their rhetoric? Absolutely. And we've had some of the most violent rhetoric you could possibly imagine in the last 8 to 10 years. And then not just violent rhetoric, but violent policies on top of that rhetoric. And that is not just, I'm not just talking about Donald Trump now. I mean, we can look at what has happened over the course of the last 4 years, and most recently in Gaza, and the Biden administration's role in supplying weapons to Israel. I mean, you can talk about violence in a whole host of ways here. But the bottom line is there's violence happening both in rhetoric and policy and in action. And so there's a hyper focus right after these events to find out the race of the shooter. That's the first thing. They want to know the race of the shooter.
Yeah, was he Chinese? Or
Yeah,
something
well,
like
or
that.
right,
Yeah.
or Middle Eastern, so that we can say it was terrorism.
Wow.
And then we want to know maybe the ethnicity, if we can't do that, and then we want to know the religion, and we're really hoping he's Muslim.
Wow. Yeah.
Right, because then we can blame it. Again, we can start scapegoating Muslims as the problem in American society. What we're really also hoping for then is it an immigrant? We've been saying that immigrants are committing crimes by the dozen. Every immigrant who comes here is committing crimes. So if we could just pinpoint this one person as an immigrant, we could prove our false propaganda narrative that immigrants are causing crime and blame it on this person and give you a real world example of our propaganda, right?
Yeah.
But guess what happens? Each stage, the narrative fails.
Yeah.
This is why it's so, I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah, honestly, it's terrifying, tragic, and also fascinating, because every stage of looking for something about this person, they come up empty, and the emptiness only leads us to have to look in the mirror at the violence of the society that we all created, that we've all accepted, that every political party has been okay with. The school shootings, the AR-15s, everything, right? Now, and so we keep looking. So then we say, well, who was he giving political money to? And so, I mean, this is just crazy. He gave $15 to Act Blue. I mean, that's a cup of coffee, right? Yeah. He gave a cup of coffee to a left-leaning Act Blue, but he was registered as a Republican. It blows all the narratives. It's perfect. He's an ambiguous, undecided voter.
Yeah.
Right? This is a person who they can't make into what they want him to be, which is amazing because most shooters, it's very easy to do that. They leave a manifesto. They had a political motivation. They were a particular religion. They were a particular race. They were trying to incense violence for not this person. And then, not even this. It's not even, like, as I said in the sermon, it's not political motivated at all. He looked up Biden and Trump. Doesn't seem to care which one he shot at. He looks up the CIA director, the FBI director, the attorney general. Doesn't really care what their politics are. He looks up the British. It's not even about America for him. He doesn't even care about whether it's American violence. He's happy to shoot at somebody who's a celebrity from the British royal party. And so again, we don't even get to say it's politically motivated. We lose every excuse with this shooter that we always cling to protect ourselves from the critique of the violence of society that we have created and become complicit in. We've created this. When I see Thomas Crook, I look in the mirror at myself and American society, and I say, we have brought the world to this point. I think the bottom line is when they're looking for motive, the only one they're going to find is fame. I wanted to make a name for myself because people thought I was nothing. People treated me like I was nothing. They treated me like people in the text were being treated, as stranger, alien. They bullied me. I meant nothing. Now, I will say I blame his parents a little bit. Both are therapists. Wow. And they had 14 guns in the house and bomb-making materials everywhere. What two therapists have, you know, the other thing is, we know that the other thing is they love to use mental health on these things, but he had no mental health diagnosis. Yeah. He was in perfect mental health. And so everything we usually use to explain away the violence of our society has failed with this particular one, and all we are left with is a grand mirror to stunningly wrestle with the violence of the society that we have created. And now we have to struggle to ask ourselves, what does it mean? And I think that, you know, I know that they're going to go and do this whole trial of the Secret Service, and there's all these questions about whether the Secret Service has enough money or funding or people, or and what happened in that moment, and that's important because we do need to assure the safety of people so that these things, you know, don't ramp up and cause more disruption. But a lot of this is a distraction from the real question conversation that we should be having is, why are 20-year-old white men grabbing AR-15s and killing large groups of people? Yeah. That's a massive question, and we need to wrestle with that question. And it can't just be, oh, their mental health is the problem, or oh, it's political. It's a more broad societal problem that we have to figure out how to address.
We have a question from the floor.
I would like to comment on the shooter's condition. Presently, I'm reading a book on Asperger's spectrum problems. And the author lives nearby, and the book was published quite a long time ago, and a very popular book for people in that spectrum for understanding. As I read the newspaper articles of the reporters who interviewed people in the shooter's life, they, from different aspects, described his characteristics. And interestingly to me, they matched one for one and continued to be symptoms of Asperger's syndrome. And I've not seen that mentioned in the press at all, but what it does is people in that spectrum that have it as strong as he did, they tend to self-isolate because they perceive the world in a very different way than neuro-traditional people do. And if they don't have help and don't understand it, then they are different. And I understand that very well. I'm not through the book, but it tells me there is good reason, and if you want to call that a mental illness problem or not, it's just, in my point of view, that he was different from the vast majority of people, and apparently his parents were unaware of it, and there was no effort to help him in dealing with the world, with the condition that he had.
Thank you, David. That's neurodivergence could be at play here. I think that's, definitely possible. And as you mentioned, kind of the symptoms of, the characteristics of someone with Asperger's, that particular form of neurodivergence, you can see someone self-isolating, especially someone who had been, attacked or bullied in school, and what that would lead to without proper attention from the thing that concerns me about that, I have a number of concerns about that line of thought is, one, I don't want to create a narrative where everyone with neurodivergence is potentially violent, because I don't see that.
I'm neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with autism, and I'm not going to shoot anybody.
That's good to know, Seth.
Yeah, it's good to know. You're safe.
I don't, because that's what we do with mental health too. We think, oh, every person with a mental health is a potential shooter, and that's not fair either. So we got to be careful. That's one. I'll just say caution. Second, I worry about how old he was and never having had anyone bring this up, including two parents that were therapists who likely had master's degrees. That makes me suspicious. How would they not have come up with that? At some point in your master's education, you may have come across this concept of neurodivergence. I would imagine even in Pennsylvania. So I do think that it's unlikely to me that by that age it would have never come up, but who knows? I mean, it could be anything. 20 is also a time when mental health breaks happen in men. So this happens to be at the age where he may have had a clean bill of health his whole life, but at this point there was some kind of psychotic break that took place, because that is the age when that takes place a lot of times in men. Yeah, we have a question. Yeah.
I'm going to push back on a couple of things. Number one, we don't know that this was an assassination attempt. I get tired of that one. We don't know who the intended victim or victims were. I think that the Republican Party, you can't say it, I'm going to say it, has taken this to portray Trump as the great wounded warrior, there with his fist raised in the air, with the blood, very little blood, by the way. We don't know whether the guy was just spraying the crowd. We don't know whether he was aiming at the family unit that he actually killed. So I won't even say assassination attempt here. But I think the problem is the MAGA movement doesn't want to say it's a problem with firearms, because they aren't going to say that.
No.
And also, from what I understand, the guy was not bullied in school. He had won some sort of science award. He was considered very bright. He had a small but sturdy group of his own friends. So we can't even say he was bullied. And one more thing, we still don't know what the motive was of the Las Vegas shooter. So this is just another attempt at, not an attempt, bullets being sprayed over a crowd, as far as I'm concerned, and that's the best way to look at it.
I do think there's something very helpful in that line of reasoning, because the commonality, you can change the religion of the shooter, you can change the race of the shooter, although it's a mostly white young men. You can change the location of the place in America. You can change the type of event. And the thing that is the same in almost every single event is the weapon that is used is a semi-automatic AR-15, which is too easy to get used. Too easy to get. And so, you can say mental health, that won't solve it. You can say political rhetoric and division in America, that won't solve it. The quickest, the most simple and clearest way to change this is to have an assault weapons ban like we once had before all this started. We had an assault rifle ban that came into place after Reagan was shot at. We got that assault rifle ban put in place, and there were not these kinds of mass shootings of this magnitude that shock and terrorize everyday people like there are now. We had, now since then, the amount of mass shootings and the amount of death has doubled and tripled every year since that assault weapons ban came to an end, because it had a clock on it. So a simple assault weapons ban would do a lot. And there are law enforcement officials that support that, because they're the ones getting shot at, like the ones here in Charlotte that got shot at with the very same weapon that we're talking about in this case, an AR-15. That's what was used here in Charlotte to kill officers of law. That's what was used to shoot at Trump. It's what was used in every major mass shooting that we have. To me, that's the line of thinking that you're saying is cut the BS, get to the thing that's the common denominator, focus on that, and that's how we make change.
Yeah,
That's one way.
The access to that. Like, it just took one psychotic break, and the shooter looks like you and me, just younger. And that so many white men are shooting themselves just from the access of guns. Just stop the access. That's the easiest way. We have another question out there from Gene.
More general comment here, and that is, I'm dealing with my own feeling of wanting to approve violence when the violence is a desperate attempt to bring attention to violence against some group. I mean, I'm not, I would have a different look at it, I suppose, if I were a business owner and my business was being burned down. But from a distance, it's like, yeah, I can understand why you're, and I sympathize with your desperation. How else are you going to, bring it to, maybe you've attempted other ways to bring attention, but finally it's like, it just to a point where patience runs out. I don't know exactly how to deal with my feelings about that, because I really do sympathize.
Yes. Well, let's be honest then, because Gene has called us into honesty. I'll be the first to tell you that my first emotions on Saturday of last week were not Jesus-like emotions. Christ-like emotions were not the first emotions that I had. I was actually, someone had given me tickets to go see Back to the Future, the Broadway show here at the Blumenthal. So I was at the Blumenthal when this happened, and I didn't realize, I had seen something at dinner, and then got to the intermission, and everybody's looking at their phones at intermission, and that's when I found out, and the things that came out of my mouth were not great. And I think that part of what came out was a thought that I have been thinking, that I think a lot of people are thinking, which is, at what point is violence maybe not good, but like a lot of things in American politics, a necessary evil to change the course of where we're headed? And I think this is a thought that we have to own, that we're thinking, even if we don't want to believe that it is good. I'll give you an example. Contrary to what you may have read in Eric Metatexis' book about Bonhoeffer, by the way, that is a trash book on Bonhoeffer. Throw it away if you have it. There are many other books on Bonhoeffer that you should read. Bonhoeffer, though, found himself in a similar situation, right? It's 1930s Germany. He's seeing what's happening, the rise of Hitler, but he's seeing it with very clear vision because of who he is, the theological principles he holds, he's a brilliant human being. He's got multiple doctorate degrees. He's preaching, he's teaching, and he's with a lot of young people who can see it happening. And he waits a long time, preaching against it, and hoping that there's an opportunity to stop the rise of Hitler. He gets to a point, though, where he realizes that it's not going to stop through preaching. That the church has been taken over in Germany. The German church is now taken over. The Catholic Church is taken over. And Christianity has become remolded in Nazi image. And now no one's listening to what he's saying. And he eventually decides to join a plot called the Abwehr plot. And this plot is an attempt. There were multiple attempts to kill Hitler. One of them was called the Abwehr plot, and Bonhoeffer was in the Abwehr plot. This is a theologian who wrote an entire book on nonviolence called The Cost of Discipleship before he decided to join this plot. So in his later life, Bonhoeffer says, now, by the way, he was unsuccessful and eventually arrested by the Nazis and put in jail and executed in jail, okay, for all that, for what he decided to do. and wrote letters from jail. In fact, that's how we know about him first, because of the letters he wrote from prison. That's what the first things that were published in English in the United States. Later in his life, he said that he understands, he didn't just do what he did without thinking. He was very thoughtful about why he decided to participate in that. But that even until his death, he believed that what he did was wrong. It didn't mean that he would not do it again. But he believed until his death. So some people believe that even until his death, he remained a theological pacifist, even though he had participated in a plot to kill Hitler, because he believed that it was wrong, even though he had participated in it. So his actions and his theology came into radical conflict at that moment in world history, in German history. And so, okay, what I'm saying is one of the greatest theologians in world history made a decision to participate in a violent plot to assassinate the political leader of Germany at the time. That question of is violence ever required or a necessary evil is a live question. It's a live question, though, at a time when we don't really know. It's hard to fully understand what we're in.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to fully understand how dangerous a moment we really are in.
Yeah.
I don't even know if any American who's lived here their entire life can see the moment for what it is, good or bad, because we're so conditioned in a particular way to think about what we're in. I'm not sure I see it clearly. I'm being very honest now. I don't know how dangerous a moment it is. I do know this, to your point, Gene, and I preached this to start the sermon a couple weeks ago. All the mechanisms for nonviolent means of democratic power to change society, to make society into the world we want it, are being reduced or eliminated. They're making protesting illegal, right? In fact, we already know that Donald Trump is planning to be able to get to marshal the National Guard to stop protesting were he to be elected and there be protests in advance. He's already talked about that openly. The Supreme Court is set for a long time. Young people on the Supreme Court, there's probably a few more changes, but what happens if those changes take place in a Republican administration? What's the Supreme Court going to look like 10, 50 years from now, right? The Electoral College, I mean, gerrymandering has messed the Electoral College is a joke to start with that we have because of slavery, but then on top of that, there's gerrymandering, right? Where they've made these districts, and then even when it's called illegal, like in North Carolina, over race, they come back and do it again. And then there's voter suppression, ways of keeping people from getting to the polls. They'll never let you vote on the weekend in America because they don't want you to vote. They want you to vote on a weekday when you have to work, so that poor and working people have the hardest time to get to the polls. I could go on and on here, but the nonviolent means for change, democracies, like Terry Stokes said last week, the rule of the people, right? The people have been taking their power away constantly. And the worry is, what will happen if more of the power that people had is taken away? What if this is the last election for a president for a while? What if I don't know these things, and I don't think any of us know them, but I wonder what they thought in 1930 in Germany. Oh, is this just another leader, saying these things and is not going to be able to achieve anything? I don't know. I don't know. That's the thing that's so challenging now, is to be in this moment and to not be able to see clearly, and to think we see clearly, but not know for sure how clearly we see, how alarmed to be, is I guess what I would say.
Yeah, I just think of the text, how it says Christ abolished the law and commandments, and realizing that those laws and commandments were actually tools of violence. And a lot of times that slips under like, oh, I'm lawful, I'm peaceful. The law is peace. No, the law is often used.
Who creates the law, right?
Yeah.
Who puts the laws in place?
And I think, on Gene's question, and it's kind of the mystery of even Christ, of here we look at Christ, violence against Jesus Christ. and how we see that as some way of peace. And that's kind of even a question I have is, how did Christ create peace? How did Christ unite us all in one body? Maybe that's too theological, but I'm just curious, like, okay, well, how was peace created through that moment?
Well, that is a good question. That Paul does not necessarily unravel all that. He leaves it for us to try to unravel the pieces of. They turned it. Okay. Let me just say that I think what Paul is saying is Paul is reading back on the life of Jesus. And he's saying that during Jesus' life, he made a particular effort to move beyond his own community and to go out into the Gentile world and to do ministry among them. In fact, in his first sermon, Jesus says to the people in the synagogue in Nazareth, the scroll of Isaiah is fulfilled, yada, yada. I came to preach peace, and I came to preach the liberation of the captives. But then he says, hey, did you know that there were a lot of people who were widows in the time of Elijah in Israel, but God sent Elijah outside of Israel to Zarephath. Isn't that interesting? And the people are like, what? And then he says, and you know what? There were a lot of people who were lepers in the time of Elisha, but God sent Elisha outside of Israel to Naaman the Syrian. And Jesus said, and he just says those things. That's all he says. And the people try to kill him and throw him off a cliff. Well, why? Well, they're fine if you say God came to my people, to heal my people, right? To save Israel. But when you say God came not just to save you, but them too, now you have a political message that transcends the identity politics of the time. And so Jesus is saying, no, I'm here for them too, not just you, right? And that's radical. And that starts to lead to a ministry where Jesus goes to Samaria, which was not considered typically part of Israel, was considered enemies of Israel at the time. Jesus goes to all these different places that are more Gentile populated areas. Here's the other thing. You ever wonder why they have 2 feedings of the 5,000 in the Gospels? Were they just bored? No. One is to Jewish people, the other one is to Gentiles. Go read it. It's in Mark. It's very clear. One is inside the ministry of Israel. One is outside, right? What is Jesus saying? I am come here to save the people of Israel. I have also come here to save everybody else. And then, this is the key that Paul's saying. Jesus created a church, the ecclesia, the community of his followers. And he said, everybody gets to be in as equals in this community. And that's the radical change. He creates a community of equals. Some of his followers are Gentiles, right? And so that inter-ethnic, interracial, interreligious, community of people who are Greeks, Romans, Scythians, barbarians, Jews, etc., women and men, people from all over the Mediterranean, all as one people united in Christ. It's the church, really, that is the vision of that inclusive ministry that Jesus. So when he says, I created peace, he's saying, I created a community. We call it the church. It's supposed to be this. I created a community where all people are supposed to come together in equality and peace. And that's the gift. That's how I made peace in the cross.
The last couple of weeks, Gary and I have been having this conversation that, Ben, your sermons were way too political. That was my take, was that, we need to get away from this pulpit and stop doing this. And so then my dear husband starts coming at me with chapter and verse of how political the Bible is, and said exactly what you did and shut me down. So here we go.
I do think that there is a natural instinct in all of us to come to church and want to hear something different than we hear all week, Some word of comfort, some word of hope in the midst of this. I think hope right now is in short supply. So I do think we have to do the work every week of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, and make sure we're tending to both sides of those well. No one does that perfectly. I'm not saying that I do that perfectly, but I do think, and I think the other thing to remember is that the sermon is not the entirety of what we offer. You know, you can come and hear a sermon and it may not be for you that week, but you maybe needed the song. You may have needed the choir and what they brought. You may have needed a prayer. You may have just needed the community of being with your neighbor in person or to just participate online. There's so much more that the church is offering than just the word. That is a primary thing if we're Baptist, but it's important to remember there's much more going on and that not everything there is partisan. I think the careful thing is to try to deal with the political reality of the gospel and how it speaks to our time, and to do so in a faithful way, not shy away from it, but also not to try to be overly partisan with it. I mean, right now, there are churches, I'd say, I don't know, what do you think? 50% of churches in America, last Sunday and this one, where some preacher got up and said that God's will saved
over
the
50,
former president of the United States.
Yeah, totally.
And I'm hearing that, and I'm seeing that online. That toxic theology. And then so you have to ask, was it God's will for that firefighter to die? And that family to be destroyed just because they went to a political rally?
Yeah.
Was it God's will for children to die in a shooting? Why didn't God save them? Why did God only save, the political leader, this political leader? That's toxic theology. That's not helpful. And so I think we have to recognize that while we may not always want to struggle and wrestle with the political difficulties of our moment, and I understand that desire, that everywhere else in America, they're not playing around.
Yeah.
They're going to wrestle with it, and they're going to wrestle with it in a poor way.
Yeah.
And in a form of theological malpractice, where they're going to bring God onto the side of their side, their way of thinking, and that is so dangerous.
People in church are probably wearing the mark of the beast on their ears. I just see that all the time.
Ooh, okay. Tough questions. I think, it's always important for people to stand up and make their voice heard if they are, if an event that is happening they believe is dehumanizing and harmful. And so I believe that people should feel the right to protest. I think here in this particular moment, for me as a white cis het man with a lot of privilege, for me to say to Jason, you really need to go protest Trump on the 24th. I'll be over here at the church. That would be pretty bad, because the way in which society is structured in this particular time, violence is much more likely to occur to Jason than it is to me. And so I don't think it is a good place for white folks with a lot of power and privilege to be demanding that people of color or folks who are LGBTQ or differently abled or et cetera, go out and protest Trump unless we are also willing to go out there and protest. So I think we got to be careful, because there is a real possibility of violence. Not maybe things could get violent. No, there is a real, right? I mean, we just had a shooting at the president. There's going to be violence at these things now. Going forward, there's going to be violence, and people have to think very carefully about whether or not. The other thing, though, is that's part of the problem with violence, is it has a chilling effect on democracy itself. It creates a fear to even protest. It will create a lot of fear about voting. And those fears will lead to all sorts of consequences. You know, the people that don't want you to vote will win when you don't vote. That's just the way it goes. And so I think we have to be attentive to the ways in which this, the fears and the chilling effect that can come from violence, and you know, how to. There are more ways to make change than protest. It's just one of many forms of violence. Yeah.
One comes from a space of having a perspective of abolishing what exists.
Yes.
And I think when we understand the concept of abolishing, it is the destruction, thank you, of what exists. How can one strike a balance of desiring peace, but seeing a necessity of creating substantial change that might disrupt the status quo? And I think this is what Gene was leaning himself to. I find myself in a constant state of, I don't know, questioning, conundrum around how can I institute dynamic change that necessitates force, especially in the state that we're in, while simultaneously holding and upholding Christian values. And when I think about, I just have a few things to say, I'm sorry, I'm excited. So the first is, I think, I just wanted to revisit, and I'll come back to where I'm at now, revisit the concept around how we see the pathology of people like the shooter, right? And I want us to just name that in American society, white supremacy has a history of pathologizing and diagnosing mental health as a proponent to which we give credence to people's behaviors. So I want to name that perhaps this wasn't a pathology, or perhaps it wasn't a mental health need. I don't want to say that it wasn't, because I think your stance is formidable, but also, what if it's just a desire, right? When it comes out of a white body, why is it that we lend ourselves to the diagnosis? Because diagnosis means that we need to cure something, as opposed to seeing it as a desire. So now, that was my take back. So bringing it back to here, how do we, in seeking change, because I feel like we do need to disrupt what exists, and I'm not saying to shoot someone, but how do we strike that balance? And what is it that we can look to in the Bible, perhaps, or like what I appreciate from your sermons is understanding who we are, like how we have historically been and who we are today, and utilizing that as a form of both knowledge and commentary. Like what can I do?
Yeah.
Because I want change.
Good.
And I understand the power of putting your body, your mind, and your spirit in the line of acquiring that change. But also, how do I find that balance between violence and peace?
Great question. Fantastic. I'll go back to my sermon first, because I do think something there is instructive. I do think that part of what I was trying to get at when I said we have to broaden our definition of violence, so to broaden our vision of peace, is very helpful here. Because when we start talking about one form of destruction versus another form of destruction, or one form of violence versus another form of violence, we have to have a broad definition of violence first to be able to address it, or we're not even talking on the same terms. That's why Coretta Scott King's quote is so helpful. Starving school children is violence, right? Discriminating against workers is violence. Not providing adequate medical care is a form of violence. We don't, and I've said this a couple weeks ago, we don't often think about policy as violence. We think about it as politics. It is also forms of violence. When you have a policy that leads to people not being able to eat, that is violent. So it's important for us to broaden our definition of violence to include policy, also to include rhetoric. I'm influenced in this by a scholar, Slavoj Žižek, who's a philosopher, who has a great book on violence. Not necessarily sure I would recommend it because he says some strange things in it, but he has some good ideas in there too. And he breaks down violence into different forms. He has symbolic violence, which is what he talks about with violent rhetoric. Subjective violence, which is usually violence between peoples. And then he has systemic violence, which is the violence that is just going on all the time, that none of us, that we see and feel sometimes, but that is seen and felt on certain people more than others. So it's more impactful on certain communities than it is on poor people of color, minority communities, LGBTQ people. It just presses on some folks harder. And so he says we have to evaluate all forms of these violence. We can't just say, well, there's like, it's not good to shoot at somebody. Well, you were asking me to live in a violent culture? I'll give you an example. Last night I was at the movies with my daughter, and she said, I ran out of Coke, Dad, go get, so I had to interrupt the movie to go get, to go stand in line, and, just a good father move, right? And I'm standing in line, and the two gentlemen in front of me are saying, this guy, one of their friends, yeah, he used to be all anti-gun. But you know what? We got him one, we took him to the range, now he loves guns. And it's like, why were you being so stupid in the way you were thinking about guns before? But now he's buying guns all the time, and we had to slow him down and say, man, these things are expensive. You're gonna ruin your family's expenses, And then the two of them began to talk about how many guns each of them had, and I'm talking, this is the most normal conversation. It's happening in the line where the milk duds are. And it's just like, we're talking about guns, like what guns we have, what we bought. And I'm thinking, you've asked me to live in a culture of violence where anybody who wants an AR-15 can have one. And you've asked me to live in that peacefully? What does that mean? What does that even mean? Every day I wake up and go to wherever I go, mall, church, grocery store, every place is a potential place of violence. Every place is a potential place of mass shooting and chaos and terror. And you want me to pretend that that's okay? And sometimes I wonder, why is anybody walking down the street pretending anything is okay? We should all be screaming. We should all be protesting. But of course, American society is set up in such a way that it makes us numb ourselves with entertainment and all kinds of things to avoid dealing with the reality that any one of us could get shot at any moment, right? Anywhere we go, because of the way so this is a normalization of violence. windows on the first floor of Wells Fargo during a protest is more violent than what they're doing on the top floor of Wells Fargo. Some of my best friends work at Wells Fargo, I want to be honest, and I love those people, but what they're doing on the top floor is worse than what's happening when you knock out a window on the bottom floor. But the world wants you to think that that violence on the first floor is worse than what they're doing on the top floor, and it's not. We have to bring them all into the same conversation and evaluate them based on the toll of bodies.
Wow. Yeah.
That's just good old philosophy and ethics. How many people are being negatively impacted by what's happening at the top of Bank of America and at the top of Wells Fargo versus that one window at the bottom, right? Guess who's not going to fix that window? The people who are at the top of Wells Fargo. Guess who's not impacted by that window? The people at the top of Bank of America. They don't care. That doesn't mean anything. They're upset about it because property damage is, it's a tool to try to say. And so that's why I said in my sermon, too often we only decry and condemn the violence that comes from the bottom up and never the violence that comes from the top down. And we have to bring those in conversation with each other. And only then will those who are benefiting from the top-down violence be able to understand that they're on warning, that we all see what's happening, that we're aware of the system. We are aware of how violence is occurring. And your violence we are aware of it. And this what you call violence over here is a drop in the bucket compared to the body toll, right? Who's funding the weapons manufacturers?
Yeah.
Who's the bank for the people that make an AR-15? Find that out. It's the same thing we're doing in environmental justice. Who's the bank that's funding fossil fuels? Right? Right here in Charlotte. We got to figure this out and talk about that kind of question because that's how we deal with these broader problems that we have.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Boswell. Is there any other questions before we wrap up? We're almost on time here. We have one more.
We have one last question right here, or two last questions.
Okay.
Sorry, she raised her.
Good.
This is really a statement of observation, not a question. As I sit here and look around, this is very reminiscent of a time back in the 60s for me as a teenager, as we sat in churches during the week and on Sundays after service trying to put together a plan, trying to decide what we were going to do and how we were going to move forward to combat the things that were happening, the injustices that were happening. And so coming through that period of time, we were left with great hope because of what we did. And someone mentioned that word this morning. And I think what has happened for me as an individual who lived through that, and now looking back and saying, my God, we're here again. You know, we were hopeful that we were out of that, but really, we are here again. And as I look around the room and I see individuals who certainly could have gone, you look eligible to have gone through that period of time with me, where were you? Were you with me? Were we, because some of us were together, some of us were not. And so what is our responsibility now? If we were there before, we find ourselves here again. How different is that? And the conversation, I will tell you, was very similar with one thing that was missing that we've talked about today. We talked about all of these things, what do we do? But there was the absence of the mention of guns. Same time, same things going on, same situations, but there was no conversation about guns.
Last question. Would you like to respond?
Let's take both and then I'll respond to both.
Last question.
A little lighter. You took a chance as a preacher to read a poem, because poems are usually kind of complex and deep, and so I would like to ponder, because you said it was, I'd love that poem, and I don't love it yet because I didn't get it. So who again was the poet?
Yes. is Denise Levertov. And I'll read it to close, but let me respond to the question first. I try to make sure that I'm a student of history, and I didn't live through the civil rights movement that you talked about, and I have to own that. But I think one of the things that we've come to recognize is that a lot of people think about America in what we call the 9-word problem. It's like slavery, Civil War, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and that's it, right? And there is a really important history starting at the end of King's life, all the way up until today. That time period is one of the most under-researched and under-talked about times in American history. And it's because most historians believe unless you study something 50 years old, you're not a real historian. And I don't buy that. But over the last, I would strongly recommend maybe starting with Baldwin's book, No Name in the Streets. James Baldwin wrote about the death of King and the death of Malcolm X and the beginning of the Black Power movement and the reasons why Black Americans moved toward the Black Power movement because of their disillusions with what happened after the end of the Civil Rights movement, right? And the backlash, the white backlash, and how swift it was and what came after. And the 70s were a very difficult time in American history for Black Americans. And then, you know, we have this sort of ascendancy of Reagan and all that comes after it, which is just a colorblind American overlooking of all the racial things that had not been overcome. The failures or the failures of white backlash against the civil rights movement of what came. The 90s are also really important. There's a great book on this called When the Clock Broke, by John Gans. And every time somebody says, how did we get here? And that's something I've said too. I think about John Gans because the 90s were like what we're living through now, just different. And so you can go back and some of you will remember, Pat Buchanan said everything that Donald Trump has said, just didn't get elected president. But everything Trump has said, Pat Buchanan once said, and he was the head of the Republican Party throughout the 90s. Pat Buchanan, they called him the watered-down version of David Duke. They basically took everything David Duke had said and polished it enough so that he could sell it to the masses. There is precedent for everything. We didn't just get here. Think, how many people do you think in America, what percentage of Americans do you think listened to Rush Limbaugh for 8 hours a day throughout the 90s? Our parents. Don't imagine that we got Trump out of nowhere. He didn't just drop from the sky. This came. This was a part of the America that we allowed happen, right? We allowed this happen. We allowed David Duke to run for political office and win. We allowed Pat Buchanan to spread those ideas. We allowed this to come to where it is now. And maybe we apologize for those things, but they are where we are. We have to be historical. And I think going back and looking at the history of what's happened since that will get us to a clearer vision of why we are where we are. The reason we have the gun problem that we have right now is partly a reaction to the civil rights movement. You know, Reagan was for gun laws at one point. I don't know if you knew that, but it was when black people were carrying guns in California. He was really against guns then. He had a big problem with guns then. Republicans didn't want guns in the hands of average citizens when black people had guns and were standing on the steps of the state capitol. But when white people have guns, everybody's happy. So this is the reason gun proliferation got to what it was a reaction to the civil rights movement to arm average white American citizens to protect themselves and to stop and create a chilling fear of black protest. We have to own that. That's how we got here. That was the philosophy underlying gun proliferation. You can read that in a book called Loaded by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about the history of the Second Amendment and particularly the proliferation of guns in America. But I think we have to be historical And remember that as people of faith who follow Jesus, we are called to not be trapped in our history. As Baldwin reminds us, most white folks are, to not be trapped in our history, but to learn about it and to face it and to own it, and thereby owning it, to try to avoid repeating the same things we've done over and over and over again. So with that, I'll read this poem by Denise Levertov. This poem, it's called Making Peace, and I'll end with it since Gene, I'll just say it is dangerous to use poetry in sermons. And one of the reasons it's dangerous is that most poems are difficult to understand. And so is this one, but some are more clear than others. And you can't use a non-clear poem in a sermon. Otherwise, it becomes just a form of abstraction. So this one's pretty clear, I think. But I'll read it to you because it's hard to hear it and digest it the first time. A voice from the dark called out, "The poets must give us imagination of peace, to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster. Peace, not only the absence of war." But peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it's made, can't be known except in the words of its making, grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid. A feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm, is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. A line of peace might appear if we restructured the sentence our lives are making, revoked its reaffirmation of profit and power, questioned our needs, allowed long pauses. A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum. Peace, a presence, an energy field more intense than war, might pulse then, stanza by stanza into the world, each act of living one of its words, each word a vibration of light, facets of the forming crystal. Thank you all.
It's beautiful. Thank you for being part of this conversation.